I want to start, I like my true and falses, so I thought I'd start with this. True or false? Do you think opposites attract? Put your hand up if you think that's true. Put your hand up if you think it's not true. Right, it's a bit divided, I would say. Little clue here. Always look at what my husband does because he's been to these talks before. So, in fact, it is mostly false. Generally, we are much more attracted to, both romantically and in terms of our friendships, to people that are like us. And I always like to kind of demonstrate this with pictures. I'm not sure if you can see. But one of my favourite games now is to walk along and look to see how like their owners' dogs look. Okay, so the reason it's quite interesting is because people do have this kind of myth that opposites attract. And actually what the science shows us is that the people that we're most likely to end up either married to or friends with are people that share the same kind of approaches and attitudes to life. People even that look a little bit like us, but also people who live near us, so even people within a geographic location. So some very interesting studies that have looked at your likelihood of ending up with someone in relation to where you live. And they've done it with kind of flats, blocks of flats, and it is literally like the floor that's closest to you makes you more likely to end up with that person than if they're on the ground floor. So simply being close to someone geographically, having anything in common with them, those are the things that make us more likely to end up with people. There is one interesting way in which opposites do attract, and that is to do with something called the major histocompatibility complex. Now, I bet you didn't think you'd be hearing that when you came out tonight. And that is actually a kind of immune system signature. And there was a really interesting study done probably about 10 years ago now where this signature is a way of us having complementary immune systems. And they found that when people had enjoyed kissing somebody, their level of enjoyment was related to how different their immune signature was from the other person's. And that has good evolutionary benefits because if we have sort of different immune systems, then when you procreate, you're more likely to create children who have a broader immune system. So that is one way in which opposites do attract. That's when we connect with people who have a different kind of immune system, but that's pretty much the only way. So that was a bit of fun to start with, but what I want to do is I'm going to break this into 3 parts. So the first part is going to be about love, and the second part is going to be about social connection, and the third bit, and what's going in the brain when we socially connect to people, and the third part is going to be to do with connecting with strangers and others. And hopefully as we go through, I will try and sort of bring in the brain stuff as we go. So I'm going to just start I'm going to talk about the 3 phases of love. And the reason I'm going to do this is because there's a really nice neuroscience. So we know what's going on in the brain. We know about different behaviors. We know about the brain chemicals that are involved in these 3 different phases. So there are generally believed or agreed by scientists for there to be these 3 broad levels of love. One is lust. The second is sort of romantic love. And the third is what they call companionate love. So let's get the lust one out of the way first. This is obviously a kind of, so this is described as an indiscriminate attraction to other people. It's very sort of physically driven. We know that there are high levels of estrogen and testosterone, so it's really driven by the sex hormones. And it doesn't depend so heavily on those things like having shared interests and so on. When we move on to attraction, I think this is one of the most interesting areas of research. And this is what we might also call romantic love, but what has also been called passionate love. And this actually shares, from a brain perspective, this shares a lot in common with addiction. So in this phase of love, people really, really want to be together. They are kind of all consumed. It's a very kind of consuming sense. People just can't wait to see the person again. It will kind of make people do things that maybe are a little bit out of character because it's a real kind of compelling thing where that person is in your thoughts all of the time. And it is that kind of love which is effectively the purpose of it from an evolutionary point of view is having chosen your partner. This is the partner you want to spend time with. And so what we do is we invest a huge amount of time in getting to know that person, in working out, is this person right for me? So again, from an evolutionary point of view, we're drawn to spend as much time as possible with that person so that we can make that decision. So again, if you think about this from an evolutionary point of view, we need to be quite efficient. If we're going to be kind of pairing with someone for the rest of our life, we need to be efficient about it. We need to spend as much time with them as possible so that we can work that out. And it's very interesting when you look at what's going on in the brain, because we see high levels of activity in the reward pathways of the brain. So the pathways of the brain, which I will have spoken about in other sessions here, where we just feel good. It just makes us feel good. And you may hear it now, people talking about the dopamine hit. And this kind of very addictive romantic love really gives us that dopamine hit. And also noradrenaline, so a feeling of kind of being quite sort of excited, not really sleeping too well, not even really needing to eat. So one thing that people will say when they're absolutely in the throes of this kind of passionate romantic love is sometimes they feel that they just can't even eat because it's just, they just don't need to. And noradrenaline kind of puts us in that very kind of excited mood. And we also notice that serotonin levels change slightly. But what I think is most interesting about this kind of particular type of love is we see a real brain signature. So when you put people into a brain scanner and you show them pictures of a romantic partner, and it is a partner that they have that romantic love for, you can see this very distinct brain signature. And it involves the areas of the brain that are about kind of reflecting on ourselves and reflecting on relationships and reflecting on other people. And it's very, very distinct. And what's really interesting about it, and I love, I'm going to go ahead to the next one and then I'll come back to that next point. So the final type of love is this concept of attachment, a companionative love. And this is really, this is a love that you might see in a long-term relationship, a romantic relationship, but you also see between a mother and a child, and you can also see between friends. And this is a different kind of emotion again. This kind of love is about attachment and bonding. And what we see here is high levels of a particular neurohormone called oxytocin. And you may have heard of oxytocin. It's a really interesting hormone that is sometimes called the cuddle hormone. And it's the hormone that makes us feel really connected and attached and close to people, to the point that it has been used in some ways as a treatment. So you can use it in children with autism, for example, to make them more sociable, to make them feel more connected to other people. And it's given as a kind of nasal spray. So oxytocin is released when we listen to music. It's released when we laugh. And in particular, it's released when we touch people and when we feel close to other people. So all of those things kind of cause this sort of oxytocin to be released in the brain. And that makes us feel very, very connected to other people. And again, we see a slightly different brain signature. So what is very interesting, going back to what I was about to say before, is that for some people, and it does, so for most people, they will kind of work through it in a kind of marriage or in a long-term relationship. They will work through those three stages. It may start with lust, it will then move to this kind of passionate romantic love, and it will then move into a companionate love. But it doesn't have to be one or the other. We know that we can see those different types of activity going on even over the long term. And there's a really kind of very interesting set of studies that showed that long-term romantic love does continue in some people. And I think it's really, there are kind of pros and cons of that, because obviously that romantic, passionate love can also be quite consuming and can sometimes make people not spend time with their friends. But it's very interesting to see that in people that report continuing to have that romantic love, you can see that brain signature when they go into a scanner. So I guess the key point I wanted to make about those things is that the brain reacts and responds to these different types of attraction and these different types of relationship and connection in different ways. It can distinguish between that very sort of visceral physical attraction that we might have to somebody else and the kind of real passionate, I can't wait to see this person again, I can't get them out of my head kind of love, and that real sort of deep, intense bond and attachment that you can have to somebody when you've known them for a long time. And there are other sort of interesting things, like, for example, if you suppress those hormones in animals, then they, so you can see that these are one of the signatures that make people, that kind of encourage fidelity. So when you see prairie voles, for example, when they have these high levels of oxytocin, they show this sort of very, very faithful behavior to their partners, but when you suppress those levels, they will start to kind of not care if other animals come near. So there are lots of ways in which these different chemicals have been explored. What I want to spend a bit more time doing is looking at the concept of social connection more broadly. And I think it's really important because, again, there are sort of pros and cons of this. So first of all, I just wanted to share some of these statistics. So there have been some really big longitudinal studies where they have explored people, that they've followed people over many, many years, like 60, 70 years, and they look at all sorts of things about to do with their well-being. And they find that one of the biggest predictors of well-being is the size of someone's social circle, the amount of time they spend in social situations. So we know that being social is really good for the brain, and it's really good for the body. In fact, one study predicted that it gave a 50% increased chance of longevity, which is quite a big difference. Interestingly, we'll come back to this in a bit later, but the more diverse people's friendship group is, the more powerful that effect is. It's also been shown to strengthen the immune system, so you can see higher levels of immunity in people that have stronger social connections. You also see lower levels of anxiety and depression. We also see better cardiovascular health, higher self-esteem, and generally people being more trusting and cooperative. Now, I guess what you can see from this is the flip side of this is that being lonely is not very good for us. And I really want to make it very clear that loneliness is not about being away from other people. So you can be in a room full of people and still feel lonely. Likewise, you can be somebody who spends a lot of time on your own and not feel lonely. So I don't want to confuse loneliness with whether you are with people or not with people. It's much more to do with whether you are feeling a sense of social connection to other people and whether you have a sense of belonging. And those are the things that seem to be really crucial. Not how much time you spend with other people, but how connected you feel with other people. And this all kind of looks a little bit magical. From a scientific point of view, this looks a bit magical. How on earth can just hanging out with people increase their longevity, boost their immune system, change levels of cardiovascular health? I mean, we can understand maybe why it might improve self-esteem and lower levels of anxiety, but those other things are really measurable physical things. So I want to try and explain to you a little bit about why that might happen. So I want to start with this idea that social connection is an absolutely fundamental part of being a human being. I want to suggest and argue to you that we only survive as a species, and we have only done this well as a species because we work cooperatively and collaboratively. It is that makes us a kind of strong, powerful, and successful species. So we know that one of the most awful things you can do to somebody in terms of punishment is to put them into solitary confinement, to the point that actually it's now been banned in New York prisons so that they can't do it for more than 15 days. I mean, that still sounds pretty horrific to me. But the point is that it is actually one of the most cruel punishments you can dish out to somebody is to put them into a room on their own where they have no access to anybody else and can't converse. Sometimes they can still hear other people, but they can't communicate back with them. So, and then I want to describe an experiment that was devised by a neuroscientist, and it's called Cyberball. And in this experiment, they have 3 cartoon characters, and you watch these cartoon characters playing, but you're told that you're one of them. So you might be player 1, for example. And what you have to do is your character has to throw the ball to one of the other characters. They throw it to another, and you're basically in a game where you're just throwing the ball to each other. So we've all probably done this when we were very small, or if you've been parents, you might have done it. Literally just a game of catch. But what they did in this is that they manipulated the situation so that some people would be excluded from the game. They wouldn't know. They would think the other characters was somebody else, another real person playing, so that they were playing an online video game with somebody else. But in reality, they were computer controlled. And the game was manipulated to exclude the person, so that after a while the ball doesn't come to you and you're kind of trying to join in, but you can't. Sounds like a kind of mean thing, a mean thing for scientists to do, but it's quite important because it's a way, of course, what happens afterwards is it's all explained to them and they're all told, you weren't really being left out. This was just a manipulation, and this is why we were doing it. But when they do this, you can see certain changes in stress hormones, that people become very stressed. And by the way, the age group that really struggle with this the most, by a long way, are teenagers. Teenagers and adolescents, for them, that social connection, that peer social connection is absolutely crucial and critical, and they really show huge stress responses when they're excluded. In fact, there's some very interesting work by a neuroscientist called Sarah Jane Blakemore, who has done pretty much all of her research looking at the adolescent brain. And she talks often about how we make judgments about what teenagers do. But what we have to bear in mind is that what a teenager is risking, if a teenager is risking a loss of friendship, so you might think, well, why are they doing that? Why would they choose to go and do that really risky behavior? You know, I don't know, climb over a wall that is really dangerous just because their friends are doing it. But actually what they're doing is they're weighing up the climbing over the wall and possibly falling with being excluded by a friendship group. And that pull and that need to be accepted as a friend at that age group is so powerful that can override it sometimes. So social connection is a fundamental part of being human. We don't like being excluded. We show a stress response. Our body responds when we are excluded. And being put into solitary confinement is pretty awful. So a couple more things that I hope reinforce this idea that social connection is really fundamental. The second is we have this thing called a default mode network. So some may have heard me mention this before. It's one of my favorite sets of structures in the brain. And it's a network of structures that essentially come alive, come online whenever you're bored. So if anyone's starting to drift off at any point and thinking this isn't very interesting, or you're just kind of distracted by thinking, oh, I wonder if I remembered to feed the cat. Or, you know, all of those things. When that happens, that daydreaming thing that we all go into from time to time, that is our default mode network. It's when we go into a default mode, we're not doing anything else, and our brain goes, okay, I can get on with the housekeeping now. And the housekeeping is things like, did I feed the cat? What did I do yesterday? What have I got to do tomorrow? Or even sometimes sort of drifting back to quite nostalgic things. That's the default mode network. But what's really interesting about that network of structures is that it involves a lot of the social parts of the brain. So actually, our default when we go into daydreaming mode is to think often about other people. So most of what we kind of drift to, and certainly what the brain activity shows, is that we are thinking about other people, things that other people have done and said, and how that fits into our life. So the brain's default is to go social, so to speak. The next bit of scientific evidence, which is a fairly basic one, but I think quite important, is that the strongest predictor of brain size across the species is not how big the animal is, but it's the size of social groups. So the size and complexity of the brain in relation to the size of the body is predicted by the size of the social groups. And that leads me to talk about someone called Robin Dunbar. I don't know if any of you have heard of Robin Dunbar. Sorry, jumping ahead. Robin Dunbar is what does he describe himself as? A social evolutionary psychologist, I think. So he has done an awful lot of experiments and studies to look at how big our friendship groups are. And he's found that it's really, really consistent. So he's found that at any one time, pretty much all of us will only have 4 to 5 very close friends or people that are really, really close to us. And that as soon as somebody else comes into that circle, somebody else almost drops away. And so we might feel like, it'd be interesting to go away, but I think of this sometimes as thinking a little bit about who you would invite to different events. So he's found that there are these different circles. So we have that immediate group of 4 to 5 people who we are, the people that we have most contact with and feel closest to and reach out to, who we would feel are our closest friends, really. And that can include, by the way, a partner or a family member or a parent. And that's what's interesting, actually, about going through teenage years, because up until a certain point, your parents will be in that group, and then at some point they get kind of edged out and replaced by friends. So we have this kind of very small group of 5, and then we have the next layer out, which is, I think he says it's 15, and then it goes to 50, and then it goes to 150. And he argues that 150 is the maximum. In fact, it's 148, but people always say 150 because it's a nicer number. But it's the largest number of social connections that people can keep active at any point. So that might be the number of people you would send a Christmas card to, for example. And they've looked at this, by the way, even in terms of things like Facebook and other forms of social media. And the same thing persists in terms of when you actually look at how people are interacting and how often they are interacting. You may have 500 friends on Facebook, but the number of people that you actually kind of know or have any sort of real interaction with, he says, is fairly consistently around 150. And it's really interesting because this is consistent across lots of different cultures, lots of different formats and mediums. And as I say, you can think of this as how many people would you, if you could only invite 5 people to a party, if you were going to have a dinner party, and it could be all your closest friends, who would you invite? And then you can kind of go up to, you've been told you can have a wedding group, but you can only invite 50 people. And you kind of get to that who's in and who's out. And actually, we're quite good at being able to make those decisions about where those lines are. Well, that person falls within the people I would invite if I could only invite 50 people. But if I could invite 150 people, then all of these other people would come too. So a number of things then. Social connection is absolutely fundamental. Our brain instinctively goes social, and our social brain predicts how successful our species is and how big our brain is. And finally, we have this kind of finite number of people we can connect with at once. This, by the way, has all been taken out to organizational stuff as well. So organizational psychology, how many people you have within an organization, how many leaders you have, how big or small the groups should be. A lot of that has fed into that as well. But I want to just try and explain that magic. I want to explain why it is that this social connection, we know why it's important. I've explained to you, hopefully it makes sense that it kind of keeps us, it's what makes our species survive. But how does that happen? Why is it that it makes a difference to our immune system, to our cardiovascular system, to our physical health, and so on? And the main mechanism is the mechanism of the stress system. So there are 2 key things here. One, the stress system means that our stress system kind of drives us to be closer to people when we're in danger. So what will happen is that if we are kept away from people that make us feel safe, and of course not all relationships do make us feel safe, but I'm talking about the relationships that are really comfortable and safe and make you feel like you have a sense of belonging. Those relationships are like a kind of home for us. So in the same way that we have a place that we might feel safe, we also have people that make us feel safe. And when we feel safe, our stress hormones drop. We feel we're in a kind of safer spot. And obviously when we're very young, that might be a parent. It might be a mum or a dad or a grandparent who can kind of make everything okay. You know, you can think about it in really simple terms, that when a child falls and hurts itself, it will run to someone. And what it's doing is it's running, it's in danger, and it's running to a place of safety. And you can measure this. So you can see in terms of brain activity and stress hormones that as people get closer, physically closer, or are able to reach and connect with somebody that they feel close to, that the stress level comes down. So our very instinctive thing to do when we are in danger is to reach out to somebody that makes us feel safe, somebody that we have a close bond and attachment with. And so when you are repeatedly kept away from other people, or you're not able to contact people, and of course, you know, many of us experience things like bereavement, all of those things are causing a high level of stress. And so the way we need to deal with that is to kind of find other people that can make us feel comfortable and safe. So we have this drive to when we're in the fight or flight mode, we have this drive to get to a place of safety. And that is much better for our bodies, because when we're in a place of safety, our bodies go into the rest and digest mode. We also know this hormone oxytocin that I spoke about earlier, which is a hormone that's very high when we are in contact with a person that we feel close to, when we have a close physical contact. That hormone oxytocin is also very good for us physically. So those two things, the combination of keeping the stress low and the oxytocin at a nice level, keeps us physically more healthy. And I've kind of mentioned this, but I wanted to just sort of stress this idea of collaboration. So togetherness and connection are really about collaboration. They're about us cooperating and working together. And as I say, this is what has allowed us to survive as a species. And there's all sorts of evidence that being involved in collective activities together, so actually even everyone coming into the room together immediately means this is a collective activity. It's something that we're doing together, and you will experience it differently and feel differently than if you were just sitting on your own having a conversation with me or watching it on a screen. So in fact, coming into this room to listen to this talk, it almost doesn't matter what I'm saying, but of course you've all come because you're interested in something that at least something you saw on the poster, and therefore you've immediately got something in common, and we're collectively here together. And of course, that collective participation can exist in very physical forms. So you can look at people who sing together, people who dance together, people who march together, anything where there is active collective participation, maybe even cooking together, the things that happen at AGK Barnet here. All of these things are really good in terms of enhancing our sense of social identity, our sense that we belong to a social group. And what we know is that that encourages us to look out for each other. So the stronger your sense of social identity, the more you feel that you belong somewhere, the more we will look out for people. So we know that one way this can be demonstrated is that when people are singing in choirs, when they do rhythmic music, I talked about this in my last talk, you can see really, really physiological responses. People's immune system changes, their stress hormones change when they've been involved in sort of singing together or dancing together. And there are even people that have argued that this tendency we have as human beings to sing and dance and march together might even be one of the reasons for our evolutionary success as a species, because it's that collective participation that allows us to collaborate and work together and look out for each other and feel that we are one and that we will do something to help the other. So what I want to sort of do in the last 10 minutes really is to think a bit about how this relates to the way we connect with strangers. And there's a few key points I want to make. So I'm going to put up a slide now, which I know at least 2 people in this room are going to really struggle with, and maybe more. I don't know if you can see. This is a football shirt that is wrong. It's a football shirt that is wrong because it's got 2 opposing teams on it, and 2 teams that that are generally in competition with each other and in high competition with each other. I put that up because I wanted to briefly describe a very famous social psychology experiment. And this was an experiment where people of rival football teams were asked to read through a statement. And the first statement was, write. First of all, half of the group had to write about what it felt like to be a football fan. So these were all football fans. They were all brought into this experiment. 50% of them wrote about what it is like to be a football fan. What do you like about football? Why do you go to the football? What's important about it to you? The other half were told to write about what it was like to be, I think it was a Liverpool fan. Let's use Tottenham and Arsenal. So half of them were told to write about what it was like to be an Arsenal fan. Then what happens is they're told to walk across to the building, to another building, and to report back at the other building. And in fact, what's happened is they've set up a situation where somebody falls over in front of them. I don't know if you can guess what's going to happen here, but the person that falls over is wearing a Tottenham shirt, let's say. I'm pretty sure it was Man City and Man U or something. In any case, one person kind of falls over in front of them. Now, the likelihood that they help that person depends on whether they've written about being a football fan or a Spurs fan. If they've written about being a football fan, then they will help the person up. If they've written about being a Spurs fan, they won't help the person up. Now, of course, it wasn't the case with everybody. But the key thing is that if you prime somebody to think, we're all footballers together, we're all in the same club, we all kind of think the same things, then you're going to see that person go, it's someone who also is into football. But if you're kind of thinking, well, I'm Tottenham, they're Arsenal, so therefore I don't like those people, we don't. And actually that's a kind of fairly simplistic way that this has been looked at, but there are many, many ways that this kind of in-group, out-group thing has been explored. So I think we have quite and it's something that I think about often, particularly in a society which I think is often quite divided, is what that division, where that division comes from and what it creates. Because we are absolutely primed to come together, to recognise a group, to be part of that group, and according to Robin Dunbar, to keep that group to a certain size. So as human beings, that's kind of what we're primed to do. But also, almost by definition, the more togetherness we have, the more we do identify with a particular group of people, the more we can start to judge or other the people who don't fall into that group. And that's when it becomes very problematic. We are all prone to doing it, and we all do it without even thinking about it. And I've talked a bit about oxytocin. So there's a bit of a flip side to oxytocin. So it's always talked about as the cuddle hormone. It's this lovely, warm, cuddly hormone that makes us feel close to people. But they've done experiments where they've given the kind of oxytocin spray to people. And what they find is, indeed, those people will be kinder. They will be kinder to people, but they will only be kinder to people in their in-group. And actually, people who have high levels of oxytocin will tend to be more negative and less likely to help people who they perceive to be in their out-group. Now, I've deliberately used the word perceive there because this is something we've just shown with the football study. This is something we can shape. So if we think of ourselves as belonging to a particular group, then we can just see other people as being the other. And we're primed to not help them and to help the people who we consider to be our kin. There's also really lots and lots of interesting work around this. I haven't got time to go into it all, but for example, we know that we have much higher levels of disgust for people. So sorry to use this kind of fairly gross example, but you can't talk about disgust and not have some kind of gross example. But if somebody breaks wind, if that person is somebody like your child, you don't care at all. If there's somebody who is a kind of member of your family, it's a bit unpleasant. But if it's a stranger, it's horrible. And if it's a stranger that doesn't look like you, it's even worse. And we are absolutely, there is a whole load of research to show we are very disgusted, much more disgusted by people that we don't consider to be part of our in-group. And this has actual implications when it comes to, for example, helping somebody that might have some kind of gory, some kind of damage, or maybe they've been sick. We're much less inclined to help someone who's been physically sick if we don't think that they're like us. So it kind of impacts on how we help people. It also impacts on how we share misinformation. So there's a lot of online sharing of misinformation, quite often very accidentally, but we're much more likely to share information online if it comes from somebody that is part of our in-group. And we're much more likely to argue against it if it comes from someone from our out-group. So there are many ways in which being part of a group is really, really important. It's a really natural human phenomenon. But what I think we have to guard against is the flip side of that, which is that we can see people as the other. And as soon as we see somebody as being an out-group or the other, we start to dehumanize. And as soon as we start to dehumanize, we can do what we want to someone that we've dehumanized, because they no longer feel like human beings to us. And so this is something that I think absolutely every single one of us has to guard against, because it comes from a place of survival and it comes from a good place, but it's also something that can be manipulated. So we can be made to feel like we are part of an out-group or an in-group if we don't fight that. So I'm going to kind of try and turn this round now and think about the positive ways in which we can kind of counter this. So there's a couple of things I want to talk about: talking to strangers and kindness. These are the last two things I want to mention, and then I've got some tips. I always like to end with a few tips. So talking to strangers is something that's been researched quite a lot by psychologists in the last sort of 10 years. And it's an interesting thing because most people don't want to do it. Most people are quite scared by talking to strangers because they think it's going to be difficult. They're not sure what they're going to be able to say. And it's something that we generally don't think we're good at. So there's a very interesting effect in psychology called the Dunning-Kruger. What's it called? We looked it up earlier. Dunning-Kruger. Anyway, that's it. Dunning-Kruger. Yes, that's it. And anyway, this effect is the idea that we always think we're better than average at everything. So if someone says, if I say, put your hand up. In fact, let's just do this. Put your hand up if you think you're a better than average driver. Well, right, you all know not to do that now because I've said, but basically, normally about 80% of people will put their hands up. Now, by definition, that can't be true. And if you ask people how clever they are or how attractive they are, all of these things, generally people think they're better and cleverer than the average person. When it comes to talking to strangers, the opposite effect happens. Everyone thinks they're rubbish at it. And actually, the research is completely the opposite. It's just not true. So those fears are completely overblown. And in a number of studies over the last 10 years, they have basically got people to go and speak to strangers. They've got them to play games, like go and speak to, first of all, today you've got to speak to a man with a hat on, and then the next day you have to speak to a woman wearing a red coat or something. And they kind of set these things up. And anyway, the different ways it can be done, it can be say hello to someone on your commute, make sure you sort of say something to the checkout person when you're going through the tills. Any of these things, they all make a huge difference. And so the research shows that it's never as scary as people think it is. And people kind of always come away with quite a few benefits. So the research that's looked at it shows that it generally improves people's mood. People often learn things that they don't expect they're going to learn. And most importantly, and related to what we've just said, it humanizes the other. Because if we speak to somebody, we immediately have kind of stepped out of our safe kind of in-group and we've spoken to somebody else. And we get to know more about other people. We learn about other people and we feel more connected. And in fact, one of the best things we can do for sort of trying to reduce prejudice between groups is to just increase contact. And actually, it doesn't even have to be real contact. It can just be imagined contact. And that is very good for sort of breaking down prejudice. And the final thing we're talking to strangers is that it spreads kindness. And I can't finish this talk without referring to my wonderful colleague, Claudia Hammond, who you might hear on Radio 4. She is presenter for Health Check and also All in the Mind. And she's done a number of books. But the most recent one is called The Keys to Kindness. And this was a book she wrote after a huge study that kind of explored kindness in many different ways. A huge amount of research now has shown that if we are kind to other people, that it makes us feel good and it improves our well-being. Really, again, very physical things. It activates those reward pathways in the brain. We actually feel good generally when we've been kind to people. It's very contagious as well. So if we're kind to one person, they tend to pass it on. So it's a passing, people tend to pass that kindness on. And bear in mind, the opposite thing is true as well. So if you are cross with someone or shout at them, they will carry that anger back off out into the world. So kindness is contagious. And acting kindly, when you are kind to somebody else, it also reduces your own levels of anxiety. So I thought I'd just share some of Claudia's tips. You'll have to read the book if you want more of these tips. But some of her tips are, first of all, one of the things you can do is look out for kindness. So not necessarily even people being kind to you, but making a point of observing it when you see kindness in the world. And the more we see kindness, the happier we feel, and the more likely we are to be kind to others. So we have a tendency to notice the nasty stuff. So she's saying, she calls it kindness twitching. Go out and look for that kindness. And this one's an important one because one of the ways in which that in-group, out-group thing can happen is sometimes to do with generations. So sometimes a particular generation can make judgments about another generation. There's a thing about boomers and millennials and these different labels that are given to different generations. So one of the things Claudia says is don't assume that children are thoughtless and selfish. So she's shown in a whole load of her research that children and adolescents are not at all thoughtless and selfish, although it is a stereotype that they often carry. She says to look for the best in people. If you use social media, this is maybe more important for some than others, pause before you post. Think about it. Would you say it to a friend? If you wouldn't say it to a friend, maybe don't say it. And I thought I would throw this one, but she actually also recommends active volunteering. So I wanted to finish. We've talked about the different types of love. We've talked about the relevance, importance of social connection and how it affects us physically and emotionally. And we've talked about the ways in which social connection can have both negative sides and positive sides. So I thought I would just end with a set of tips. The first is spending quality time with the people that you love. So it's about putting time aside and actually kind of making a point of actually doing something together that you're going to enjoy rather than just coexisting. And it's something that we all can forget to do from time to time. So making a real active effort to make sure that some of the time you spend with your nearest and dearest is really good quality time. The second one is small talk. So having small talk, the kind of things we talked about, like speaking to a waiter, speaking to someone on a train, if you're in a waiting room. My mum always does it. She'll always start chatting to people in the waiting room, always. But actually, there is also, you might have seen a big Samaritans campaign showing that small talk saves lives. So actually, there is evidence that even just stopping and asking somebody about the weather can make all the difference for them. Small acts of kindness, that can be donating something, it can be saying something kind, any tiny act of kindness. Attending and joining a group. Asking for help. Now, that's a weird one, but actually the evidence shows that if we ask for help, it actually makes that person feel better. It's actually quite a kind, nice thing to do. Now, this is a special tip from me, and it's reflecting on the use of the word they. So whenever you hear yourself say they, stop and ask yourself, are they really they? Are they that much different to me? You know, we might be using it in a perfectly innocent way, but often we'll say, oh, well, they don't like things like that, or they are like this, or they always go down. You know, as soon as you hear yourself say that word, just pause and ask yourself about, are you othering people? Are you dehumanizing them? Are you thinking of them as somebody who's not like you? Practicing empathy. So we can practice empathy, reading books about other people's lives, watching films. All these ways are really good ways to try and imagine how other people might be feeling. Seeking out common ground. I think that's something that we can do on even the smallest, and it's something that we fairly naturally do. To look out for something that we have in common with people. challenging your own defensiveness. I say this because actually as human beings, our natural reaction is to go, no, I didn't do that. It wasn't me. And actually sometimes the kindest thing we can do to someone is to say, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean to do that. We often, the first thing we will do is go into defense mode. And the last two things, one is giving to a charity. So we can sort that, can't we? Can't we, Helen? And the other really, really simple one is just listening. So can I just say thank you all so much for listening to me for all that time?